Hey friends, today I wanted to take you along with me on my sourdough journey. So I've been baking sourdough now for half a year or so, and I definitely still consider myself a beginner, but I thought I'd take you along with me baking a loaf. So today I wanted to test out something new. I tested out Autolyse. So basically I mixed water and flour and salt and let that sit overnight. Then I add my sourdough starter that was fed yesterday, and then I'm just combining everything, just making sure that it mixes well together. And once it is mixed well, it's time to build the dough strength. So I'm tipping it onto the counter and just stretching and folding the dough. The important part is not to use any flour, but to really use that stick to stretch out the dough. At this point, I definitely noticed that the dough was more sticky than I was used to, but also more supple, is that the word, than I'm used to. So the Autolyse definitely made a huge difference. So I'm just stretching and folding, and when I find that the dough becomes a little too sticky to handle, I just let that sit and come back to it 5 minutes later. So as you can see, the dough stretched out quite a lot, so it still hasn't got much dough strength. So I'm just continuing the process of stretching and folding until I find that the dough is nice and strong and elastic. So I actively stretch and fold for about 10 minutes or so. But as I said before, I was having a lot of trouble with the stickiness of the dough, so I just did my best and tried to build that dough strength. At this point, I was also a little bit worried that I had done something wrong with the Autolyse, since it drastically changed the dough in some parts for the better, some parts for the worse. It was just so sticky that I felt like something was wrong, but I just kept on with the process. So here I'm extracting a sample bit to control the dough growth, and here I'm rounding up the dough and placing it in a glass container for the bulk fermentation, so basically for it to rise and double in size. Pro tip here, clean your countertop right away, especially if you have wooden countertops, and use your dough scraper to really scrape off the dough so you're not left with cemented in pieces. Then when the dough has flattened out about 1 to 2 hours later, I do a very gentle coil fold, this is called. So basically you gently lift up the dough and let it stretch and then fold it over. You do this on all 4 sides, again, to build more dough strength, to make it more elasticy and more chewy in the end. These are all great things that we want for bread. Then again, when it has flattened out more after about 2 hours, I do another coil fold. So every time the dough flattens out, you want to kind of fold it back up. At this point, I definitely also realized the dough is much stretchier and softer to handle. I was just noticing all the little differences that the Autolyse created. So I really like to do this where I change one little thing and then really pay attention to what it changes in the bread. Then again, back to letting that rise. So as I had said, the dough just feels completely different this time, and I think it really is because of that Autolyse, because I let that sit overnight. But I researched a little because I felt like it was too sticky to the point where I felt like something was wrong, and it turns out you're not supposed to Autolyse that long, because I Autolyse it overnight, so it was more than 10 hours. You're only supposed to Autolyse it for a few hours at max. You can do it overnight, but you're supposed to do it in the fridge, which I didn't do. And apparently if you Autolyse it for too long, the gluten structure starts to break down and it won't hold together. And that might be what happened this time. So I might come out with a completely flat bread. I don't know. I feel like when you're baking bread, at least for me, I feel like I'm so in the dark and I don't know how it's going to turn out until it actually comes out of the oven. It's such a mystery box. But yeah, I'm just going to continue my usual process and see how it turns out. So it's been about 6 hours, and as you can see, before the dough was up to the line, and now it hasn't doubled in size yet, but it has definitely grown a little bit, very, very slowly. But the temperature today isn't very high as well. So I'm going to actually stretch and fold the dough once again, and then keep it under more close monitoring since it doesn't need too long anymore. You can also definitely already see a few bubbles here on the surface, which is really exciting. It means that the yeast is hard at work. So I'm back from some yoga to check on my sourdough. And as you can see, it has almost doubled in size, not quite, but I've learned that if I let it double in size, sometimes that means it has gone too far. Not all flours are able to double in size, and since my flour doesn't have a very high protein content, I go a little bit less than double in size. Now comes my favorite part, actually shaping the dough. So this is my makeshift banneton. I'm flouring it very generously so it doesn't stick later on. Then it's time to flour your work surface. This is really the first time you want to start flouring the dough, and you just tip out your dough and wait for it to come out by itself. You really don't want to be bursting any bubbles. This time I definitely noticed it came out really difficultly. It normally comes out much faster. I'm using my dough scraper to scrape flour under the dough so that none of the dough sticks to the work surface. Then I fold the dough into itself by a third, and then the other side, kind of like folding a letter. As you can see here, I was really struggling with the stickiness of the dough. This hasn't happened to me with other doughs, so I was, as I said, starting to get really worried. Then you roll it up. Again, as you can see, I'm really struggling here. Usually this works so much easier. I'm doing my best and then pinching in the sides, flouring the top and placing that into the banneton. Look how supple and jiggly that dough is. I love that. Then I'm stitching in these sides together, just pinching that together to tighten that shape better. A tight shape is helpful in a better rise when it is in the oven. The dough just opens up better or inflates better. Then flouring the top as well so that nothing sticks to the cloth. So what happens now is we basically want to proof our dough. So it means we want to let it rest and let the gluten structure kind of relax a little bit so it's not too tight, so that when it inflates in the oven, it can inflate really nicely. Now this is a really tricky part of the process, at least for me. There are many ways to proof your bread or your dough. Either you do it at room temperature, then there's also a room temperature hybrid freezer method. Then there's also a refrigerator method where you just put it into the fridge, oftentimes overnight. I've tried the fridge method and the standard room temperature plus freezer method. And to be honest, the room temperature method for me at the beginning was really tough, since the guideline was you poke into the dough and if it springs back too fast, you wait. If it springs back too slow or not at all, you've kind of failed. So it has to spring back the right amount. And for me, that was really confusing to grasp. What is even the right I mean, what is considered fast and what isn't. So that was really difficult for me to understand. So I decided to go with the fridge method, but I felt like the fridge method, my bread wasn't turning out right. I don't know if my fridge isn't cold enough and it just is fermenting to the point of over fermentation. I have no idea, but last time I resorted back to room temperature proofing and kind of figuring out this finger poke test thing, and I think I can work with that better than with the fridge method. So I'm going to let it sit at room temperature. And just now poking it, I felt like it was already quite relaxed. So I'm going to really keep a close eye on it, since it can really quickly go into being over fermented, overproofed, and basically your bread is going to be flat. But again, it's always such a trial and error, and sometimes it fails and I don't know why, and it's what makes bread baking fun, but also what makes it really frustrating. So yeah, this time I definitely felt like the dough was very, very sticky, not something I'm used to, which isn't a very good sign, but we'll see. So it's been about 1.5 hours. So let's check the dough. I'm just gonna poke right here. It feels like it might be almost there. It springs back, but it leaves a small dent here. But I'm going to wait for a minute and see if that dent is still visible or if it's recovered, because if it's still visible, then I think, or I would say it's ready. So after a few minutes, you can still see the places where I poked. So I'm thinking this is about ready, but this method I feel like is really unreliable, at least for beginners who don't have that much experience. So this is going to go into the freezer now. I was actually going to have the bread with this stew that I'm making. It's a potato pea carrot stew or soup, but the bread isn't ready in time. It just took a little bit longer than expected, which is why I got out some sourdough bread that I froze from last time. And this time's bread will just go into the freezer for next time. So here I'm adding a tray of water into the bottom of the oven for some steam. We really want the oven to be nice and steamy for baking. Preheat on 250 degrees. As you can see, it's nice and steamy. And then place the dough on my bread stone. Working quickly here so the steam and heat doesn't all completely escape. As you can see, the cloth was slightly sticking to the dough, but it was nothing major. I could peel it off. Then slicing into the dough so it can open at that cut nicely. And then I'm spritzing the dough with water just to give it that extra moisture so it can open up and inflate nicely. Then adjusting the temperature down to 230 degrees Celsius and letting that bake. This is always the moment of truth where we see how it turns out. I remove the top tray that shields the heat from the top, so you don't want too much heat coming down from the top, and removing the water as well at the halfway point after 30 minutes of baking, and then we bake it for another 30 minutes. In the second half of the bake, the dough doesn't rise anymore, but we want to have that nice golden color that also is responsible for the flavor. And that's it, and that's this time's loaf. I was actually pretty satisfied with it since I was so scared in the beginning whether it would turn out well. And then I always have to do a taste test with some olive oil to really taste how the bread tastes, to check if it's nice and tasty. I like to smell it and really look at the holes to assess the loaf, how it looks like, and just take mental notes of this loaf. So after each time I make sourdough, I like to kind of sit down with how it went, what did I learn, what do I want to do differently. Yeah, so I'm going to do this with you guys this time. So definitely number one thing I learned, Autolyse really helps me in my case, in the sense that I definitely want to do Autolyse again. It made my dough so much stretchier and softer, and I think because of that we'll be able to inflate better in the oven. But I'm not going to do it overnight anymore, or I'm either going to drastically cut back the time of my Autolyse, or I'm going to do it in the fridge as one article suggested. Going to experiment around a little with the Autolyse, but it did make such a big difference, so much bigger than I expected it would. Then the next thing I learned definitely is to be really meticulous with every single step, since the sourdough process is just such a long process and there are so many steps, and it really is about precision. So if you do one thing differently, a little bit too much water, a little bit too high of a temperature, and one thing is slightly different, it will definitely change the results. So it's kind of like science, or in science experiment, you have to be really meticulous when doing your experiments. You can't just randomly change whatever, because then you don't know what caused this effect. So this time, for example, I wasn't very meticulous when it came to preheating the oven. I accidentally had my oven tray already in when I was preheating, and that just means that the heat that is supposed to heat up the pizza stone or the bread stone to bake on, it was cut off by the baking tray. So that meant the heat couldn't get down to the stone and preheat the stone properly, and I think I would have probably have yielded better results if the stone was able to heat up properly. So it's definitely something I'm going to look out for. I feel like every single time I catch myself doing something by mistake, just forgetting one thing, or just doing something that I didn't mean to do, and because of that it just changes the whole result. So just to be careful and to be meticulous. And yeah, I mean, so far so good. I've never had an ear, or the part that opens up of the bread is called the ear. I've never had it open up that much, so that is definitely in progress. But in general, the rise when in the oven wasn't great. It could be better. So I am a little bit of a perfectionist in the sense that I do see areas where it could be better, and I want to try to do better next time. So definitely the rise could be better, but that could be due to a number of reasons. One could be that the stone wasn't hot enough, so I'm definitely going to have to try it out next time. But this is basically how I learn sourdough. So I do also a lot of research into theory and look up recipes, but I kind of go my own way in the sense that I do my own recipe, I try to tweak it, and with every single time I try to learn something new and try to understand what went wrong and what will I do differently next time. And this way is more tedious and longer, and I've been so frustrated before, but this way also means that I think I can better understand the science behind the sourdough, or why something happens or doesn't happen, because I go through this trial and error and I tweak this one thing, and this means that this is now better, and yeah, which is a really fun way to do sourdough. Of course, I also want perfect bread, but it is also about the journey as well as the destination. And yeah, oftentimes the bread tastes amazing either way. It just could be a little bit better. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting, my approach of learning sourdough, even though I've been doing this for almost half a year now, and I still feel like I'm not good at it. I'm still a beginner. Yeah, but with each loaf, I learned something new. Let me know in the comments down below if you bake sourdough. Do you have tips for me? Yeah, I'd really appreciate any help at all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe inspired you also to bake a little, get a little creative and experimental. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe for more on simple living, living better with less, and living healthier and freer and happier. Then be sure to subscribe for more on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!